The Sicilian Expedition is one of the key events of the 5th century BC and of the Peloponnesian War in itself. And really, it sets the tone for the start of Athens' collapse and the loss of Athens during the Peloponnesian War itself. Now, despite Pericles warning the Athenians in 429 to stay away from the Western Mediterranean and to not expand their empire, the Athenians were persuaded by Alcibiades to attack Sicily. And really, Alcibiades' idea was that the Athenians would gain the wealth and the power of Sicily easily, and then they would be able to conquer areas in North Africa and in the Mediterranean before then taking all those combined resources and finishing off Sparta. However, obviously, that didn't happen. So why and how did the Athenians end up getting involved in a conflict in Sicily when they already had a war that they were fighting with Sparta and the Peloponnesians in Greece itself? It's some distance. How did this happen? Well, if we look at Sicily itself, Athens already had existing treaties with some Greek cities on the island. Remember, big chunks of the southern Mediterranean had Greek colonies and Greek cities already in existence, and like the Greeks in the mother country, had already allied with one side or the other. So Athens already had an existing alliance with Egesta, which was now in a conflict with its neighbouring city of Selinunte. Sicily was dominated by the powerful city of Syracuse, a Dorian city, and natural ally of the Peloponnesians. So Egesta was in a conflict with Selinunte and requested Athenian assistance. And similarly, Leontini, on the eastern side of the island, was in dispute with Syracuse and also asked Athens for aid. Thucydides tells us the story of how Egesta sent cash to provide ships and convinced the Athenians that a mission to liberate the cities of Sicily from the domination of Syracuse could be funded from the wealth that would be found in Sicilian temples and Sicilian treasuries and Sicilian cities. As always, there was a debate in Athens between those that wanted to go on the campaign and those that were completely against it. Now, Nicias, who'd negotiated that peace treaty with Athens and Sparta that had collapsed pretty rapidly, he'd also lost a lot of political prestige with that, and he was opposed to an attack on Syracuse, so he exaggerated the forces needed, hoping to put the Athenians off. But in short, that doesn't work, and the Athenians simply committed more forces to the attack. Nicias certainly didn't trust a young man in a hurry, as is how he described Alcibiades. Alcibiades, though, was able to persuade the Athenian assembly by promising them rich rewards, and that the conquest of Sicily was an opportunity to cut off supplies from the Peloponnese, grow wealthy. And it's this that Thucydides particularly attacks in Book 2, verse 65, when he laments the change in Athenian attitude and decline in Athenian leadership following the death of Pericles in 429. Interestingly, though, Thucydides tells us that the force that set sail to Sicily was the most costly and finest looking force that had ever set sail from a single city. The troops received extra pay, the whole expedition was very expensive, and the hopes were of the most far-reaching kind. So a total force of over 30,000 troops initially set out, including 134 triremes, 130 supply ships, and over 5,000 hoplites. However, unfortunately for the Athenians, just before the expedition was due to set sail, there were a couple of really negative omens. First of all, the expedition was due to launch in line with the festival of Adonis, which is all about lamenting the loss of youth and the death of youth. But more disturbingly was the mutilation of the Hermii, where Herms in Athens were mutilated and, as Plutarch says, had their extremities broken off. And pretty much the Athenians blamed this on Alcibiades and his supporters. So even though Alcibiades set sail to Sicily with the fleet, it goes with a cloud of suspicion hanging over him. The three commanders that were sent by the Athenians had three different strategies. Now, Nicias being sent is an older guy. He's suffering from an illness. And Nicias basically just wanted to sail around the island, make a show of strength, and then return back to Athens. Lamachus, whose idea is the best, which is a surprise attack on Syracuse, was ignored mainly because of a status issue. And Alcibiades coming up with the worst plan. And Alcibiades' plan was to make alliances with the various cities of Sicily and then attack Syracuse when Syracuse had been alienated. Crucially, though, Alcibiades was recalled back to Athens to stand trial for sacrilege because of the mutilation of the Hermii. But instead of going to Athens, Alcibiades instead returned to Sparta, or rather fled to Sparta, and gave the Spartans two devastating pieces of advice. Number one was that the Spartans must send aid to the Syracusans, and that meant that the Spartans sent the fantastic general Gylippus to go and aid their Syracusan allies. The second piece of advice was going to be equally devastating for the Athenians, and that was that he said that the Spartans, rather than occupying Attica for just weeks at a time and then retreating, should permanently occupy the strategic fort of Decelea. So Alcibiades' strategy was the one that was assumed by the fleet, even though he was soon recalled to trial to Athens, but instead fled to Sparta. The Athenians still used his trial and sent messengers across the island to all of the different towns. This results in something called the debate at Camarina. Camarina, you can just see at the tip of the island. And Thucydides recounts the debate that takes place in Camarina between the two representatives. So it's part of Alcibiades' original sort of plan, and is all about pressurizing settlements to ally with the Athenians. And there's a debate in Camarina between Euphemus, who's from Athens, and Hermocrates from Syracuse. And essentially, the Camarinians have a pretty tricky decision to make. Hermocrates certainly fires first, and he says that if the Camarinians look at the experience of the Greeks in the mother country, they would have no hesitation in allying with Syracuse because the Athenians are not to be trusted. And Hermocrates makes a really great example, and he asks the people of Camarina to look to Greece itself. He says the Athenians are hypocrites. It's scarcely logical for them to be destroying cities in Hellas and restoring cities in Sicily, to be showing all this care for Leontini whilst holding down in subjection Chalcis. Now, the reason why he makes that point is because what he's trying to say is that actually Chalcis, Leontini's mother, had been really dominated and controlled by the Athenians, as evidenced by the Chalcis decree. And what he's saying is that if Chalcis is Leontini's mother and the Athenians have subjected Chalcis, then surely this care for Leontini is merely just a pretense. In regard to the Sicilian expedition, we don't need to know massive amounts of detail on it, but we do need to know some of the mistakes that committed by Nicias, the Athenian commander, and some of the great things done by the Spartans. We could be aware of the idea about building defensive walls to block in the Syracusans, but Gylippus builds counter walls. Nicias appealing to Athenians for reinforcements, and those coming under Demosthenes to the tune of 73 triremes and 5,000 hoplites, more eggs put into the same basket. And then we've got the disastrous defeat at the Battle of the Great Harbour, when Nicias refused to listen to pleas to retreat because of a lunar eclipse. The Athenians are annihilated in Syracuse. But we also have to give credit to the Syracusans and to Gylippus, who trains and raises forces from Syracuse's allies. The Syracusans adapt to their naval tactics, and essentially the Spartans and the Syracusans are able to up their game, to block the Athenians at all different turns, and to inflict a devastating defeat on the Athenians and their attempt to conquer Sicily, which will have ramifications for the last part of the Peloponnesian War.